be fair. And, I think 11 is pretty fair for Game. I think there's also, I don't have any arguments if you want to put them all the way up to 6 or 5. I think it's to each their own, different tastes. I think the one thing you cannot argue with the Game, though, is that he really held the whole, not just LA, but the whole coast on his back for, if not a decade, then a half decade.
Yeah.
Arkatech Beatz.
What's up, everybody? What's up, everybody? It's the Arkatech Beatz Music Business Podcast. We got a special guest in the building. We got a music journalist, Mr. Wavvy, in the building today.
What's up? What's up? Thanks for having me, fellas.
We're gonna be talking about hip hop and that controversial top 50 LA rappers list of all time, amongst other things.
Stirring the pot.
But before we get started, man, tell the people where you're from, how'd you get started in this, and
So I spend a lot of my time in LA. I spend a few months of my year in Los Angeles, but I'm actually born and raised in Montreal, Canada. I started off when I was 16. I know I got some curls up here right now, but I had an even bigger fro and thick glasses. I looked like McLovin from Superbad. And I worked when I was 16 at this music marketing site called Wavvy. And everyone was kind of like, yo, what the fuck is this 16-year-old doing around our office? They were all, in their 20s, starting their professional career. And I was just this little awkward 16-year-old, lanky, tall, running around the office doing everything and nothing. And they're like, man, you're so funny and you're kind of awkward and we should set you up with your own series. So they made sure I knew how to write a pitch email. They made sure I knew how to edit and shoot on camera. And they sent me on my way. So I started over there. Some of my first interviews were Mac Miller, rest in peace. And then Charlie XCX, who's having a moment the past year and then some. I was one of her first interviews. And then, after 6 months of Wavvy, which is why I have the name Mr. Wavvy, I wish it was a cooler story. I branched off and did my own thing. I've worked with everyone from Wu-Tang Clan, G-Eazy, the director of Space Jam, some of the Stranger Things kids. And then I've done a ton of freelance work as well. I've written for Genius. I've written for OkayPlayer. And of course, the reason we're here today is because I've written for Complex.
Yeah, that infamous Complex, man. We're gonna have to really get into that.
But before that though, like what made you pretty much fall in love with hip hop, or what made you become a fan of hip hop? Like, what was it that geared you in that direction?
Yeah,
I think a lot of people get put onto music by their parents. My father loved to ride around in his car with things on full blast, and I think Outkast in particular. He had the Outkast Greatest Hits album, the one that has The Whole World and Funkin' Around, and of course all the hits. And just, I think something about Outkast in particular is a good intro to anyone who wants to get into hip hop. You've got the lyricality, but you've also got this kind of funkiness. And I think the funkiness of Outkast kind of opens the door in a real inviting way. And, even like, especially we're talking about 2001. So, when he was riding around town, I remember this one time you had blasting Miss Jackson. And when the chorus came, there was these construction workers on the side and they all stopped what they were doing when the, ooh, I am for real. So I think moments like that made me fall in love with hip hop.
That's dope. That's
definitely dope, man. Like,
I'm 28. Just as I guess I'm showing my age with that story. I was 4.
That's probably the next question I was going to ask you, because you can tell, like, for example, there are a lot of, like, the other day, was it Tyson Knott kind of got ridiculed a little bit because he didn't know who Wale was. And it's like, the big question is, was he supposed to know who he is because of the age and when Wale was popping? Or so there's a big thing about that, about, there's some kids who didn't know about Nas or didn't know, Raekwon. Like, what do you think? What do you think about those controversies? Like, do you think that if you're a kid of hip hop, or if you're a person in this game, but you're young, you're supposed to automatically know those artists before you claim to be a fan of hip hop?
I mean, I think the other way you could flip it around is if it was us three and we're looking at, the new XXL freshman list, so we're looking at the lineup for Rolling Loud. Are we going to know everyone who's on those lists? You know, that's like a young man's game. And I'm saying that as a 28-year-old, I'm already like an elderly statesman by this point.
Right.
More every year the XXL freshman list comes out. Every year I know less and less people, and that's like, you know, it's a sign of age. It's the hip hop's a young man's game, and so I think for guys like Kai, it'd be more strange if he didn't know people on the Rolling Loud or XXL lineup than if, you know, Wale's like not a legacy artist per se, but you know, his peak was 2009, 2011. I think Kai was an actual child around then.
Right. I think he was nine when some of those records came out. But you said something interesting about it being a young man's game. Is that true? Because I mean, if you think about it, hip hop is 50 years old.
Yeah.
Like is that fair to say? Because, you know, we haven't had an opportunity to see how rap ages. Like, we're living it as we're going.
Right.
So to automatically say it's a young man's game, wouldn't we need to see another 20, 30 years to see what happens with Jay-Z? What happens with Nas when they start, like, you know, those artists are still putting out music. So is that kind of a fair assessment to say?
What did Gang say on Young One Blood? Say when you're 36 and you're still rapping. You know, Gang's obviously older than 36 now. Keeps it going. You know, I was listening to Slick Rick's new album last night, and I was thinking that the Grammys and award shows of that nature should add kind of an adult contemporary hip hop genre.
I agree.
Because it feels like, you know, the best rap album category in particular, there's just too much different variation going on. And it's not to say that everyone in like an adult contemporary needs to be older, but it feels like there's you know, we are getting to see artists in their 40s and in their 50s, and I mean now beyond, you know, still making music and still sharing new perspectives, and it's like totally uncharted territory, and it's beautiful to see. But it feels like also you can't group it into, you know, what we just talked about with Young Man's Game as well.
That's exactly my point. I don't think that Nas should be playing on the same station as Ice Slice. You know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, I think that there should be your own lane, and they're both respectable. I think, you know, young artists creating a certain kind of music should have the right to grow and do their thing. But it should also, as the older artists are making records and growing, I think it kind of shows the young artists that there's something here later for you down the line. Like, it doesn't have to end at this age. You can still cross over when you get to a certain age or a certain caliber of music, and there's still a career for you, and there's still a future here, and you can still make great, mature music, if that's what you want to call it, and still be able to tour and do things. So that's kind of my perspective on that. Joe, you got anything to add on that?
Nah, what I was gonna say on that is, like, I think that's probably the best thing in saying and segmenting the two, because like you said, it's not the same. You know, we would like to say that it's the same, but it's the same genre, but it's not necessarily the same based on, you know, the content and the age barriers. But I wanted to go back to Mr. Wavvy and asking him, like based on your age, like, what makes you want to go back and, you know, I'm looking at this list and other stuff, like, what makes you want to go back and listen to a lot of those things, you know, and kind of study those things? I know you grew up on it, but what continues to kind of keep you, you know, listening to the old stuff as well as, you know, trying to find out what's happening in the new stuff?
Music's just a magical thing, you know. In terms of new music, it's like it doesn't come along very often that there's something that's going to, you know, make you really blown away. And that's not a bad thing, you know. When it does come around, it's really special. But I think the search for that, and when it does come around, that it's quite the payoff, you know, really resonates with me. And then, you know, in terms of the classics, it's like there's like an alchemy to making a timeless record. And sometimes, you know, it's because there's a lot of thought put into it, and sometimes it's just an artist feeling the moment, and it comes out beautifully because of that.
I agree with that, especially when we're talking about finding timeless records. I think right now, that's where the struggle is with music, is that I don't think people really understand what it takes to make music that is going to last more than just a moment. It's going to last over time. And when I look at, like I said, going back to your list again for these top 50 best rappers, it's like, you know, these are folks that when you look at this list, you're like, okay, how do these people make the list? By having, you know, things that are considered timeless, and it can put them in the category that they can be, you know, even mentioned when we talk about this type of stuff.
Well, I think whenever you make these lists too, you know, we celebrated 50 years of hip hop a couple of years ago. It's like it's more and more a challenge, you know, a good type of challenge to try to encapsulate that kind of history and different generations of different sensibilities in a 50 piece.
Yeah, definitely with that.
It's definitely challenging because, you know, you may have artists on your list that may have not put out music in quite some time, but they were a serious impact on hip hop, you know, even to now. Like a lot of the new artists made, like, you know, maybe like, for example, an NWA or you know, Eazy-E, you know, rest in peace, you know, like all of these artists, or even artists that's no longer here, you know, they've contributed in such a way, but they're no longer really continuing to put out music because of, you know, either they're no longer here or whatever. So it's hard to compare, you know, their work to artists that are fresh and new and coming out with new and exciting music, you know. So when you put a list like this together, which I'm looking at, I can see why it'll be so controversial. You know, different age groups are probably looking at this. You have probably a 20-year-old looking at this list, and a person who's, you know, in their late 40s, and they have their own biases and tastes, you know. So I could see, but what I want to ask is, what is the number one thing that you heard about this list?
Yeah, I was just about to ask you the same thing. What's the number one outside the game? We know the game was on your neck for it, but what was the number one thing besides outside of that one?
Before I'm the more and more time passes, and the more and more I hear from Game, the more and more I think we're going to get some bars about this list on the documentary 3. But you know, of course, the other big thing is Tupac not being there, and you know, there is an argument in the list that kind of explains why that is, and you know, what constitutes an LA rapper. Because you know, even when we were making the list, we had this whole spreadsheet where people got to debate and argue, and you know, whether it was positions or again, what constitutes someone as an LA rapper. Obviously, what we're defining as LA is a widespread that, you know, you could have someone like Ab-Soul from Carson and then other rappers from more LA proper. But, you know, in the article, it kind of defines if you're raised musically as a Los Angeles artist, you know, if you, let's say you came to LA as a teenager and that's where you kind of kickstarted your musical career, which would fall under people like Ice-T or Corrupt, who aren't necessarily from LA. I think that's what constitutes an LA rapper. And so in the case of Tupac, you know, he's born in New York, kind of, you know, primarily established his career in Oakland or the Bay Area, and then, you know, had some incredible work with Death Row, but was already established as an artist. So it's kind of difficult because I think there's a whole other argument for the fact that, hey, that time he had with Death Row, you know, with those final releases in his lifetime were impactful enough to make him not only an LA artist, but the LA artist. I personally, I would put Tupac on the list if it was up to me. So for the record, my involvement in the list was primarily just writing those 4 blurbs. Like I said, we all got to argue about placements and, you know, debate whether or not certain things shouldn't be included, but I wrote blurbs about will.i.am, Corrupt, Warren G, and Snoop.
Right, I saw that.
But, you know, other people on the list were much more vocal, you know, especially the Los Angeles-based artists, the Los Angeles-based writers were like, hey, you know, this person here means a lot to the city. They should be higher on the list. This person, you know.
Who was the one that had the best argument for who should be higher?
Who should be higher? I mean, Jean Paul, who was one of the writers on this list, he wrote about 5 blurbs. He was very, very vocal. You know, he does this thing called, I'm going to botch it. I think it's the Hip Hop Report Card. And, you know, he's very, very involved in the LA community and does a lot of great work there. So, you know, there were artists like G Perico where he was like, hey, this person should be higher on the list. This person has a great reach within the city of Los Angeles. I think where people like me, who, again, spent a lot of time in LA but aren't from there, have a different perspective is I'm able to, you know, talk about what I see when I go to Los Angeles, when I turn on Power 106. But then I'm also able to talk about, you know, what I see in terms of artists from LA having reach internationally. I'm from Canada. The day I got asked to do the list, I went to go see the Far Side in Cypress Hill play at an arena. That's beautiful to see, 50 years of hip hop and all these legacy acts are getting to have their flowers with arena tours. But that's not everyone that gets to have that at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that's probably what I would say about this list. Is not just I know it's an LA list, but I think also the impact outside of the region should definitely have been a little bit considered more. But when I look at this for me, I can't see Snoop not being the number one. Like, I understand that Kendrick is the guy right now, but if we're talking about of all time, Kendrick's career is still going, and I think Snoop would be the larger international icon.
I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that Snoop is the most well-recognized rapper internationally.
Period.
I could ask my grandmother, who's born in Morocco, or I could go to Indonesia on the street and say Snoop, and they know exactly what I'm talking about.
That's what
Absolutely.
I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
And
that's really.
I'm just scrolling through the list real quick, and to see Warren G at all the way at 20 is like, huh?
Well, so I think there's a couple of factors that play into decisions like that. Some of it's recency bias. I think also artists that don't have all of their music on streaming, have a little bit of impact as to where they're ranked. MC Ren as well. MC Ren does not have most of his music on streaming. And people forget, like, MC Ren is a platinum artist as a solo artist, not just with NWA. And, he had impact when his music came out. And the key terms there are came out because my generation or generations after don't get to go back and experience MC Ren just because his music is not readily available. Similar to Warren, there's a couple of Warren G albums that are not available on streaming. The one with I Shot the Sheriff, and that impacts how different generations are able to get an entry point into his music, or how people that grew up on that are able to revisit it.
Let's talk about the game issue. What was his issue? So that
his issue, he said that he could kick any of the 10 people we put above him's ass.
I'm scrolling through this list now.
I'm going to look the same way.
I think the argument for the game, to be fair, and I think 11 is pretty fair for game. I think there's also I don't have any arguments if you want to put them all the way up to 6 or 5. I think it's to each their own, different tastes. I think the one thing you cannot argue with the game, though, is that he really held the whole, not just LA, but the whole coast on his back for if not a decade, then a half decade.
Yes.
Until YG rolled around and Kendrick rolled around, that was
absolutely
the game's coast.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to bring him up, because I do feel that really the game doesn't get the props that he's supposed to get, honestly. And I do think it's really because of some of the nonsense that he gets involved in. So I think that puts a little shade over some of his accomplishments. Sure. There's some things that happen that people are like the G-Unit situation, and they clown him about the freestyles. He keep saying the same freestyles, and a lot of different
red rolls.
A lot of things he gets entangled in. But at the end of the day, he put out not only a great body of work with the documentary, and even the second project, he sold a lot of records.
A ton.
And he really brought the West Coast back, and has even influenced at that time New York. And if you think about some of the artists that we had in New York, that's kind of playing with some of the West Coast music, whether it's, the Diplomats or even 50 himself. So he doesn't get enough props, and I definitely think that Game should have been much, much higher on the list. Maybe even I would say top 5.
I mean, just Nipsey alone, I've heard so many people arguing just if you switch Game and Nipsey. I think the thing with Nipsey is, if you are no longer with us, and if you passed away at a certain period in time, it's kind of a strange wording, but you know, you didn't have the time to
make the impact.
To mess up your legacy.
True.
And so, you know, if let's say the game retired or game went out in 06, you know, we'd have a very different view of game than the guy who, you know, burns bridges and starts shit, and you know, it has controversy off the mic as well.
That's a very good point for you to say that. Folks don't have enough time to destroy themselves, because, you know,
I always say one and Tupac and Biggie, one of them would have done a song with one of Lil Jon beat, 100%. You know how much Puffy was getting down with John? Like, we would have heard Biggie on a Lil Jon beat for sure. It's like he didn't have the time to, and no disrespect to Lil Jon, but I don't want to hear Biggie on a Lil Jon beat. I want to hear Too Short on a Lil Jon beat.
But yeah, that is true. However, you know, if you're great, you know, I think the general public will allow, like, okay, you know, you took an L here, or this record wasn't it, because we do it all the time when it comes to albums that drop. You know, okay, this album wasn't the best, but you know, we still rock with you. When Nas put out a record with, was it Genuine, the You Owe Me record?
Yeah.
He was crucified for that record. They're like, how, you know, you putting out a commercial record like this, and they crucified him. But then at the end of the day, you know, his fans, including myself, you know, stuck around, and we've got some great records. You know, the Stillmatics, the Ethers, you know, a lot of great records. You know, after that. So, you know, it's a good point to argue. You know, as far as messing up. You know,
it's funny because I could say that, and then also the argument I make for Snoop in my blurb is that one of Snoop's greatest successes is his lack of fear of failure. You know, Snoop does not mind experimenting with anything, you know, whether it's funk, whether it's reggae, whether it's, you know, country music. And there's something about Snoop in particular where there's this confidence that he is fine doing whatever it is as long as it's still somehow true to himself. You know, you could laugh at the reggae record, you could laugh at Snoop becoming a Rasta. At the end of the day, Snoop took some elements of Rastafarian culture and used it to be, you know, placing more of a priority on being a family man and things like that. And of course, that's outside the music, but, you know, all that to say, it's still true to himself to a certain extent.
Can every artist do that? Or does it take you to be a great to be able to do that? Like,
only the icons can take those type of risks, man.
I don't know. Snoop in particular, like, he is such a chameleon in a positive way. You know, he can really blend into. I think if Dre was doing that, it wouldn't. I don't want to hear Dre do a reggae record. That's not true, actually, because, you know, there's Mafia Music 3 on Rick Ross's album that was originally meant for Detox. That's Sizzla and Movado. That's a great record.
Right.
The last. What are your thoughts on the last Dr. Dre and Snoop album that came out, which is what's it called?
Missionary. Yeah.
What was your thoughts on that?
I am a diehard Snoop fan. I have Snoop as a Slinky from Toy Story tatted on me. I call him Slink Dog. But, you know, if you like that Compton record that Dre put out a decade ago, this is basically just Snoop getting the Compton treatment. You know, whether it's like production style or, you know, like Dre really directing Snoop. This is not a record that Snoop had a lot of, like, a heavy-handed writing. And, you know, I think there's a lot that Dre's doing to bring the best out of Snoop, but you really just have to be into that, you know, that 2015 onwards, very overproduced, you know, cinematic Dre style. So I enjoyed it. I honestly felt bad that Snoop put out a new record so quickly after, because I feel like people didn't get a chance to really, like, marinate with it. I totally understand people that it's not their cup of tea either. It's very not Snoop. So, you know, if you're used to a certain Snoop, this is not it. But this is Dre trying to bring out the best possible, you know, like, elegant cinematic version of Snoop, in my opinion. What do you guys think of it?
I think that's a very good assessment to say cinematic and elegant. And I think that's probably where that music was landing, because when we were talking about it, we were saying we wanted it to be a little bit more gritty, right? Yeah. And we wanted it to have that you know, just to have that little bit more of that vintage hip hop, you know.
A bit of that vintage hip hop, a little bit of that West Coast attitude.
Yeah.
You know, a little more edgy, a little bit more arrogant, a little more ignorant, just a little bit. Like what it felt to me was this album could be played, you know, in a safe space. Like it could be played, you know, at the Grammys.
I was gonna say,
you know,
Grammy
like,
for your consideration event.
Right. You could play it live. The instrumentation, you could play it live.
But that's what it appeals to, because of the instrumentation and the musicianship.
Right.
Whenever you see those type of albums that are built on that type of instrumentation and musicianship, it's for that consideration.
Because I heard records on there where I was like, why didn't you just use the sample? It would have just been a whole lot grittier versus just replaying it, and it kind of lost that grittiness. But by replaying the sample, you kind of put it in a space where you could actually tour and play it, you know, live, and it will sound just like how the album sounds.
I know what you mean. Like, I felt that way particularly about the Tom Petty record, the one with Jelly Roll. Like, if they had just let the old school, you know, Last Dance with Mary Jane sample go, it would have felt a lot different. It feels very polished. Right. You know what I didn't know about samples on this record? Because I wrote an article for Genius on like the history of Snoop and Dre, or their best collabs. You know the song where they're going back and forth? It's like the third song on the album.
Third song on this album?
On the Missionary album.
What's the third song?
And you're gonna miss us on that one.
Yeah.
It's the one with the MIA sample in the chorus.
Oh, okay. I remember that.
Name's escaping me right. Out of the blue. So that it has a sample in the back that I thought was Sister Nancy or something, and it turns out, you know, I'm looking up the artist while I'm doing the research for this article, and it's a not-for-profit of autistic children who want to make music. And if you listen to the voice of someone going watermelon fantasy over and over, I thought it was Pato. I thought it was Sister Nancy. I didn't pay attention to it at all until I looked up the artist. I'm like, yo, why do they have 86 monthly listeners on Spotify? But it's cool to see. It's like, you know, the charity was really touched and gave their sample, no problem. And yeah.
That's amazing.
Man, that's
there's stuff behind the scenes that you wouldn't normally know, you know, that stuff like that. So that's wow, that's dope.
Definitely eye opening. So when we talk about samples, I know you're with, you know, with Genius and these type of things, and we were talking about it earlier offline about Timbaland having this thing now, AI artists, AI label,
Suno
going crazy. What's your thought on this whole AI stuff, and what do you feel like it's going to do as far as, you know, the music and the culture?
I have many thoughts, guys. I have many thoughts. You know, I'll start by saying I know Timbaland has been having these kind of like open sessions on TikTok, and you know
they roasted him.
But you know, he's been like there's that. But before he announced this artist, you know, he was encouraging young artists to submit their music that he'd listen and give feedback.
Yeah.
But the thing when he announced this AI artist that hit me is, oh shit, all of those artists he was encouraging to send music on TikTok was feeding this AI.
Yeah.
And
that's what they say. That's what they say, but I don't know if that's true.
I mean,
I hope not, because I know someone from my city who was submitting music and Timbo was going crazy with it and calling his line and this and that. And I hope that guy's not getting kind of, you know.
I mean, I think that's with anything that we submit. Whether, you know, anything, we talking on our phones, we were submitting our voice to something.
Right.
Like there's so many programs and so many pieces of technology that we utilize day in and day out that, you know, our TVs right now, that our smart TVs, you know, they're listening to our, so then if you do, then if you don't, who knows?
I'll say this about Suno, you know, the software. I think it's very interesting. You know, it's like ChatGPT is very interesting. It's a technological advancement. I've sat in on a couple of sessions where people use it. And it's funny because my first reaction is, wow, this is like incredible how fast this could make melodies. But you aren't going to make a Neptune's level beat. And ironically, you're not going to make a Timbaland, you know, when Timbo was at his prime, you're not going to make a Tim level beat using that software. You know, I think of that all the time with journalism too, you know. If I wanted to, I could just prompt ChatGPT to write all my work, but I look at, the people who are my goats and my influences. And at the end of the day, they weren't doing that. Why should I?
But it's real, and I think you'll always be able to tell the difference, because even with me using Suno, we're early adopters of that in audio, and it's like there are limitations. There are certain things that it can and it can't do. And when I was seeing people, I had put a post on TikTok about it, and people were saying, "Oh, he may have used their music," and I'm like, "Yo, this is Timbaland we're talking about, right?" It's like, do you know how much music that this person has made over the last 20, 30 years? Like, there's no need for them to actually take your music and put it into a generative AI. So it's like I think people are just more upset that, hey, they thought that he was going to put somebody on, but in 2025, nobody gets put on. You got to put yourself on. You know that, and I know that. Like, that's just the nature of the music industry right now. No one puts you on. If he's playing his music on your platform, on his platform, he's essentially giving you, his audience, and you have to take that and run with it. So I think a lot of people were looking for him to sign somebody, but it's a large undertaking to sign artists, and it's really a headache. And
So do you think that's one of the reasons he went in that direction? Like, do you think it's more of, it's sometimes it's a headache to work with an artist. And me and Jug, we know from experience, time and time again, sometimes you work with the artist and they either think they know it all, or they don't always listen to the advice that they give you. So someone on Timbaland's level, do you think that, having an AI to do exactly what you needed to do to create the music as a producer, create it how you want it, do you think that is one of the reasons why you say, you know what, I have full control over this, I can make the music I want, and then I can put it out 100%, own it 100%, and there I go? Do you think it's a control thing?
No, I think, Timbaland wants to be an innovator. He wants to be a Steve Jobs. And I think, I imagine that the thinking in presenting this to the public is, wow, they are going to really respect the innovation that I'm doing in this field.
Right.
And it just backfired, obviously.
I think too many people are afraid of it. And when you say the innovation, I think he was giving us a peek into what's to come from the majors. Right.
Well, yeah, I think the other thing is when you use AI, there, especially for something creative, there's this connection of laziness. People connected to, like I said, you're not, people didn't do this, I mean, 5 years ago, let alone 10, 20. And so, if you're someone who's Timbaland, especially, and was able to make such innovative beats, whether it's stuff he was doing for Missy or Ludacris, The Potion definitely sticks out in my mind. Dirt Off, I mean, it feels like if you were so good at being innovative, or give it to me, like, I think some of the drums and claps are like garbage cans on that. That's not something you're going to be able to churn up with AI. And so I think it's like, man, if you were so innovative as Timbaland's thinking is, oh, I'm going to continue to be innovative. I'm going to be the first to be on AI. But the public's thinking is, no, don't use AI for something creative. That is lazy.
But I think also, when I heard one of the back and forth of one of the people that he had on the stream, it seems like the young lady who's an artist had a fear or concern that people are going to use more AI and artists are going to be replaced. Do you hear that? Or, is there any concern about AI kind of just replacing artists totally?
I did a lot of consulting and communication work at an animation studio a couple of years ago, and we were going to a lot of conferences, and, AI is obviously pretty big in that space, how quickly you could turn up animation, no problem. We were doing a lot of high quality work with high profile clients from Disney to Warner Brothers. And, understandably, our animators were pretty scared of their jobs being taken away. I think the ones who are the most perceptive kind of understood, though, that AI is not here to take away your job if you're good at it. It's here to help you do the job to the best of your abilities. And it's kind of like, how could you, and I understand Tim's kind of, embracing it here, because it's like, how could I be a leader in showing people how to make your job easier, or how you could make AI like enable your superpowers.
Right.
Yeah, I totally believe that too. I believe that it's all about being innovative, and like imagine you being able to, as a full creative, being able to use AI, to help further that creativity. I just think people are being short sighted with it, and they get a little bit scared. And then also, I hear also, folks feeling as if, I put in this much time, and you should have to put in as much time as I put in order to get the same results. And the truth of the matter is that there'll always be things that help to minimize people's time. That's what technology's for.
Well, I
Like,
think there's also like the legal gray area. It's like it's like, well, it's technically sampling using some of these softwares, right? And so, where does that come into play with ownership and royalties and all of this? It's super great right now what it will be like if you guys submitted a beat to a record, and how that payout goes, I think, with using softwares like Suno.
I think once we get past the lawsuits, and I think that's what these guys are going to use the lawsuits to kind of hash out before the labels get involved and start to kind of see if they can get a portion of it. They're saying that I don't know if you guys are on, if you notice on Suno, they have this remix function where if you upload something into the system and if you have the remix button on, if somebody decides to take that and use it into their music, you will always be able to get credit. So it's fingerprinted in that way. So I think as we start to move forward, I believe that there's going to be a royalty assigned to that. So when there's a derivative of like a regular sample or somebody's input, there'll always be maybe a fingerprint, maybe like a blockchain thing that will give somebody their credit in perpetuity. And if you can get to that, then that's when people are really going to start using it. I'm like, hey, you could use my work and I get credit for it. Have at it. You just have to be compensated. I think if you can find a compensation structure, then I think a lot of people won't have the concerns that they're having.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
I think as far as with AI and all the technologies that we have, all of the software and beat packs and everything that we have at our disposal, like what frustrates me about the music scene is that we should have more incredible music. Like we at this point we should have records that are just like blown away. Like, oh my goodness, the sounds, the way this is put together. Like, do you feel the same? Or are you comfortable in? Because some people would say, oh, hip hop is in its best space right now. In my opinion, I just want more, especially with the way technology is now. We should have more.
I think it's like you guys said, it's never been easier to get your music out there. It's also, you can't get put on anymore. You can't get put on unless you're showing that you have the savviness to build an audience or generate buzz around your music as well. So all that to say, there's probably tons of great music we're just not hearing because people don't have that extra step of being able to market themselves.
That's true.
And it's interesting. It's like still, I think only artists are really coming around to it now that TikTok makes it so accessible. But if you're putting budget into music for mixing, for mastering, for paying producers, for studio sessions, you should also be putting in marketing dollars towards great content around your music. And whether that's, sponsored ads on certain platforms or just hiring a cinematographer to help you with a vision. And it doesn't have to be a full music video. It could be several 15-second videos at this point. I think there's people just missing that step of, hey, I'm creating great music and I'm putting a lot into it. How could I put a lot into the distribution element as well and the visibility element?
I think it's really because, artists have to wear multiple hats now. At one time, the artists could just do their part and walk away, like, Wu-Tang, the artists would go in the studio, record the records, and leave. And RZA would have to be the person to fix this, edit this, sequence it, move verses around, then deliver it to the label. Then the label does their part, Yeah, everyone had
even
it.
Wu-Tang forever though. You had like incredible visuals with Triumph and everything.
Right. So we had, but the thing is everyone had their part. But now, as an artist or a producer, you have to be savvy in all of those other areas. You got to make the record. You got to be able to sequence it. Then you got to be able to take that hat off, put on your marketing hat, and be able to market, promote. Then you need to understand budgeting and know how to budget your stuff. So it's more challenging for the average kid trying to be an artist. They got to learn a whole lot.
But if you can do it right, I think it's easier than ever to get eyes and gain attraction around your music.
Yeah.
This is where I want to give a shout out to. Her name is Zaina. She's from my city. She used to have a deal with Rock Nation. Incredible R&B music, and you know what she did? She just puts out really great TikTok content and really great Instagram content before any of her music drops. And she's like, you know, putting in budget to like rent out a studio and film in front of a green screen, a blue screen. She's renting out like venues to go film little almost like skits. And it's just like she's building real stories around the music she's making, and it's paying off in a major way. And she knows like what kind of audience to target. You know, it's really great R&B music, and so she does like, she calls it like clips for the girlies, and you know, she wants like these Y2K girlies into all her music, and it's like she has a vision, she has an execution strategy, and it's paying off, and I'm proud to see.
In that, that's what's up. That's what's needed. That's what it takes.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, I've been around other artists where it's like, hey, my project's completed for 2 months. I need to spend the next 2 months strategizing what it's going to look like to gain attraction to it. And I think more people should have that, especially if they're indies, and especially if they don't have a team around them. It's like, you're telling a great story with your music, hopefully. Tell a great story in terms of how you're going to attract people towards your music as well. Because unfortunately, it can't just be the music.
Right, that's true.
So what I would ask now, so where do you see it all going now? Because I mean, you're on the you're reporting, and you're kind of looking at everything from a bird's eye view. Like, where do you see the music going? Me and Mike have these conversations because we say, you know, who's next, right? You have you guys right now who are basically solidified in hip hop, but who's next in your opinion, and from what you've been seeing? You know, just from, you know, just being around.
I mean, next is like a tricky thing to say with the person I have in mind, because I feel like she's not next, she's here. But Doechii is like incredible. And again, with what she's done visually as well, you know, she's made really compelling music, but also like crafted a strong visual identity around her music as well. And I think that's what we're going to see more of.
I think recently with the whole Kendrick and Drake back and forth, I think music came back more to a little bit of like lyrics and content, because there were artists that was putting out music that ceased for that whole time. You know, there were certain regions that nobody was hearing anything from when that was going on.
Right.
And I think it's because the audience at that moment, they were listening. And I think we're still in that area of people that are listening. And I'm hoping that we can build on that, you know, go back to lyrics and content.
Well, you know, whoever you think won or lost that beef, I think both artists played into the other one's strengths to make their best records of the beef. You know, Drake is not always known as, I think Drake's a great lyricist, but he's not always known as the most lyrical guy. So how do you go against Kendrick? We tap into Kendrick's greatest strength with his lyricality. So, you know, on the records like Family Matters, you know, you had Drake really in like a lyrical capacity that we hadn't seen him in years. And then on Kendrick's side, it's like, yeah, Drake has #1 hits. Drake has club record. How am I going to stab Drake? I'm going to talk my shit on a DJ Mustard beat, and you're going to hear it all summer, anytime you go out dancing, anytime you're at a cookout, anytime you're at a block party, anytime you're at a club. And I think that's the difference maker. It's lyrical, but it's also, you know, he played to Drake's strengths, which is making hit records. And he's like, all right, I'll make a hit record, Mustard on the beat, ho.
So it's like they swap superpowers
Exactly.
for a minute. That's it.
It was so necessary. It was like it hit the reset button. Like honestly, like that was something that we needed. That we needed that, like you said, Mike, for people to start listening again. And then some of that mediocre music now, it's not really being tolerated. And that's how come you kind of see it kind of being a little bit stagnant right now.
And then you have this whole Joey Badass versus the West Coast thing that's bringing a lot of great records too. Shout out Raekwon as well.
Good music, yeah. Yeah, that's all we want. That's all we've been hollering about. And to Mike's point again, it's like at this point in technology, you have the most access to producers ever. You have the most access to songwriters ever. You got AI, you got all this stuff, home studios, all types of technology. People can do stuff live, real time across the country. Like, why isn't the music better?
I mean,
You know,
we're also getting Slick Rick dropped last night. Nas's label alone, we got Slick Rick, we're getting a Nas and Primo album, we're getting De La Soul, getting whatever Big L, I don't understand what that means necessarily. We're getting Raekwon, we're getting Mobb Deep, and we're getting Supreme Clientele 2 from Ghost.
Yeah.
So not only are you getting great music from new artists, but you're getting established artists breathing kind of new life and giving new perspectives. I think Nas has done a great job at that in that whole Magic and King's Disease, franchises or whatever you want to call them, trilogies. And so, not only are we getting great music from new artists, but we're getting established artists breathing new life and new perspectives. And again, hip hop is 50. We haven't, this is uncharted territories of, where these artists are able to go and talking about this point in their lives.
Oh,
it's definitely uncharted territory.
When are we getting the top 50 New York rappers? And when are we getting the top 50 music producers, LA and New York? Like, when are we getting all of those other lists? Any bubbling, anything you're hearing at a complex or anything like that? Any word on?
I know my editor is taking a long-deserved vacation right now. I hit him for something yesterday, and not only is he on vacation, but he said, I'm on vacation. There's a link when it says vacation. You click it, and it's got the Jay-Z song Vacation. So crazy. I think he's taking a much-deserved break right now. And, a lot of these lists are like refurbished from when I was in high school, like 2012 and in that era. So a New York list exists that was written years ago, but it's just like a little hard to dig up. I would be very surprised if we don't refurbish and, breathe new life into that list pretty soon. I think there'll be a lot more. There was an Atlanta list that dropped not too long ago. I'm sure we'll keep the ball rolling. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a Bay Area list. It's hard for me to say, these aren't my decisions.
And I guess if we keep going on this path, with Timbaland, there might be a top AI list. Top AI artist list.
AI artist list, something like that.
I want to do one of top unreleased albums.
Why? Yeah.
There's and it's like, I think that's a great way of bridging the new generation too, because, there's artists like Juice WRLD who unfortunately passed away and had like apparently thousands of songs in his vault. But then, there's like the obvious ones like Detox, or, Timbo and Dre once debated doing an album together. I think it was called Chairman of the Board.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it'd be really interesting to explore, 50 years of hip hop history through, the biggest what ifs.
Yeah. There was, I think, was Big and Jay.
The Commission.
The Commission. Yeah, that would have been interesting.
Tupac One Nation.
Yeah.
One where he's going to bridge all of hip hop together. Man, there's tons. There's tons when you start to really think about it.
When you think about it, there's tons.
And then we're finally getting one of them this year, which is that Nas and DJ Premier album.
Yeah. Yeah.
What y'all think that's gonna feel like?
Man, I think Nas is just having a moment right now that it's like the King's Disease stuff, and then Jay's 444 is like it's like leading the charge of grown man hip hop. It's like, I know Andre 3000 not too long ago was saying, you guys really want to hear me rap? Like, I don't know what I want to rap about it.
Yeah, man, come on, man. Somebody talk to him.
He said, I'm not going to rap about my colonoscopy. I'm like, I don't know about all that, man. It's cool to hear Nas getting older. It's cool to hear Nas has a called Brunch on Sundays. I'm like, hell yeah, that's what I want to hear from a rapper in his early 50s or late 40s.
Just talk about your life, man. Like that's really really the reality of it. It's just your life.
Talking about his grandkids being his biggest inspiration. You know, he's got 10 grandkids. That's beautiful. Like, I think there's a line on a Snoop song from like 20 years ago, the one with D'Angelo and Dre. It's called Imagine, and I forget if it's Dre's or Snoop's line. I think it's Dre's, but you know, he says, "Imagine Biggie had a son. Imagine Pac being called Pop by one." It's like we're getting to experience that now with the whole generation, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
What's up, man?
What's next for you?
Next for me, just man, keep the ball rolling. You know, I got a few articles coming out, got a few on pitching.
Okay.
And I do media consulting also, so you know, always busy with that as well.
Okay.
That's what's up.
What's next for me is enjoying you know, you guys have New York background. It's like enjoying the next 100 days before it's cold again.
I was gonna tell you to just tell the people where they can find you, man.
You can find me on, I'm not calling it X, I'm calling it Twitter. Twitter and Instagram, I'm Mr. Wavvy with 2 V's. And then the rest, generally just Mr. Wavvy. Thank you guys, man. I had so much fun today.
Thank you. We went over a lot of things, man, and we got some insight, and it was a great conversation. I love these conversations, just going back and forth, talking hip hop, giving thoughts, and really just trying to push this culture forward, get everybody thinking and talking, you know. So thank you for taking a time out to just hang out with us and chop it up.
Absolutely. And give me a shout if you guys ever find yourself north of the border. I'll do the same if I'm in NY or the A.
Absolutely.
Appreciate you, brother. Mr. Wavvy, man.
Have a good one, guys.
Thank you. Peace.